There are places in this world that exist between what we know and what we've lost. Hidden in the folds of ancient mountains, carved into stone older than memory, they wait. For former Navy SEAL Ethan Brooks, the letter that arrived 3 months after his wife's funeral felt like a message from beyond the grave. Grace had left him something, a property he'd never heard of, built into a ridge in the North Carolina wilderness. He and Jax, his loyal German Shepherd K9, would drive into those mountains searching for answers. What they found was a house that defied logic, a structure that breathed with the earth itself. But beneath its floors, something was stirring. The mountain was being torn open by forces that saw only profit, and Jax's instincts were screaming danger. Ethan would have to choose: walk away from the past, or stand and protect the one thing Grace trusted him to guard. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The rain had been falling for 6 days straight. It drummed against the windows of the small rental cabin in Fayetteville, North Carolina, a relentless rhythm that mirrored the hollow beat inside Ethan Brooks' chest. He sat at the edge of the worn couch, his hands hanging loose between his knees, staring at nothing. The television was on, but he couldn't hear it. The world had gone muted the day Grace died. Beside him, pressed warm and solid against his left leg, was Jax. The German Shepherd, a retired military working dog with a coat like midnight smoke and eyes sharp enough to cut through lies, hadn't left Ethan's side in 3 months. Not since the funeral. Not since the moment Ethan had come home to an empty house and realized that silence could be louder than any explosion he'd ever survived overseas. Ethan Brooks had spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL, operating in places most people couldn't pronounce, doing things he'd never be able to talk about. He'd led teams through desert storms and mountain passes, through firefights that left his ears ringing and his hands shaking long after the smoke cleared. He'd been decorated twice, wounded 3 times, and had watched brothers fall in battles that would never make the news. But none of it, none of the training, none of the missions, none of the scars had prepared him for losing Grace. She had been his anchor, the one person who could look at him after a deployment and see past the armor he wore. She didn't ask about the nightmares. She didn't press him for stories he couldn't tell. She just held his hand and reminded him that he was still human, still capable of softness, still worthy of love. And then, one ordinary Tuesday morning in September, she'd collapsed in their kitchen. An aneurysm, silent, swift, merciless. She was gone before the ambulance arrived. Ethan had stood in the hospital hallway, still holding the coffee cup he'd been drinking from that morning, and felt the world tilt sideways. The doctor had spoken to him words about ruptures and brain bleeds, and nothing we could have done, but Ethan hadn't heard any of it. He'd just stared at the sterile white walls and thought about how Grace had been laughing 20 minutes earlier, about how she'd kissed his cheek before he left for his morning run, about how he'd never hear her voice again. That was 3 months ago. Since then, Ethan had drifted. He'd gone through the motions, funeral arrangements, condolence calls, paperwork that never seemed to end. Friends had reached out. His old team had checked in. But Ethan couldn't find the words to respond. He felt like a ghost in a world that had lost its color. The only constant was Jax. The German Shepherd had been assigned to Ethan during his last deployment in Afghanistan. Jax was an elite military working dog, trained in explosive detection, patrol, and apprehension. He'd saved Ethan's life more than once, sniffing out IEDs before they could detonate, alerting to enemy positions in the dark, standing between Ethan and danger without hesitation. When Ethan retired, Jax retired with him. It was rare, but the bond between them was so strong that the Navy had approved the adoption. Jax wasn't just a dog, he was a partner, a brother in arms. And now, in the aftermath of Grace's death, Jax had become something more, a lifeline. The dog watched Ethan constantly. When Ethan didn't eat, Jax would nudge his hand. When Ethan sat in the dark for too long, Jax would press against him, grounding him with warmth and weight. When the nightmares came, dreams of Grace slipping away, dreams of missions gone wrong, dreams of blood and sand and silence, Jax would wake him with a gentle paw on his chest. Ethan had no idea what he would have done without him. Jax's ears twitched at the sound of the mail truck pulling up outside. The dog lifted his head, amber eyes tracking movement through the rain-blurred glass. Ethan didn't move. He'd stopped checking the mail weeks ago. There was nothing out there that mattered. Bills, condolence cards from people he barely knew, advertisements for life insurance, and cemetery plots. But Jax stood. The shepherd walked to the door, looked back at Ethan, and gave a low, insistent whine. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Not today, boy." Jax didn't move. His tail stayed still, his posture firm. It was the same stance he used in the field when he detected something critical, something that couldn't be ignored. Ethan rubbed his face with both hands, feeling the rough scrape of a beard he hadn't bothered to trim. He rose to his feet, joints stiff from too many hours sitting in the same position, and crossed the small room. He opened the door. The cold air hit him like a slap, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of wet pine and earth. It was the first time in weeks that Ethan had felt anything at all. The mailbox was a few steps down the gravel path. Ethan walked through the rain without a jacket, barely feeling it. Jax followed close, his paws silent on the wet stone. Inside the mailbox was a single envelope. It was thick, cream-colored, expensive paper, the kind of envelope that carried weight even before you opened it. The return address was from a law firm in Asheville, Caldwell and Finch, attorneys at law. Ethan turned it over in his hands, water beading on the surface. His name was written in elegant script across the front. Beneath it, in smaller print, Estate of Grace Eleanor Brooks. His breath caught. He tore it open right there in the rain, his fingers clumsy and cold. Inside was a letter, typed on official letterhead, and beneath it a second envelope sealed with red wax. The typed letter was formal, almost sterile. "Dear Mr. Brooks, we regret to inform you of a property matter that has come to our attention following the passing of your wife, Grace Eleanor Brooks. It has been discovered that Mrs. Brooks was the sole inheritor of a parcel of land located in the Blue Ridge Mountains, McDowell County, North Carolina. This inheritance was previously unknown and came into effect through a family trust dating back to 1948. The property includes a residential structure of historical and architectural significance. Per Mrs. Brooks's instructions, you are named as the designated heir and guardian of this estate. Enclosed is a personal letter left in our care by Mrs. Brooks to be delivered to you in the event of her passing. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss next steps. Sincerely, Margaret Finch, Esquire, Caldwell and Finch, attorneys at law." Ethan's hands were shaking. He looked down at the second envelope, the one sealed in wax, the one that had Grace's handwriting on the front. "Ethan, when you're ready." He stood there in the rain for a long time, water running down his face, mixing with something warmer. Jax pressed against his leg, solid and steady, a tether to the present. Finally, Ethan folded both letters carefully and walked back inside. He didn't open Grace's letter that night, or the next. He kept it on the kitchen table where he could see it every morning when he woke up. It sat there like a question he wasn't ready to answer. The sight of her handwriting, the familiar loops and curves, was both comforting and unbearable. But Jax never stopped watching it. The dog would sit beside the table, eyes fixed on the envelope, as if he knew it contained something important. Sometimes Ethan would catch him sniffing at it gently, his nose barely brushing the paper. "She's not coming back, boy," Ethan said once, his voice rough. Jax looked at him with those intelligent amber eyes, and Ethan could have sworn the dog understood. On the third morning, Ethan sat down at the table with a cup of black coffee. The rain had finally stopped. Pale sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, catching the dust in the air. Jax lay at his feet, chin resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. Ethan picked up the envelope. His thumb traced the edge of the wax seal, a pressed image of a small bird in flight. Grace had always loved birds. She used to sit on their back porch in the early mornings, watching the cardinals and finches that visited their feeders. She said they reminded her that no matter how heavy the world felt, there was always something light enough to fly. He broke the seal open. The letter inside was written in Grace's handwriting, the ink slightly faded but still clear. My dearest Ethan, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I'm so sorry. I wanted more time. I wanted to show you this place myself, to take your hand and walk you through the doors, to watch your face when you saw it for the first time. But life doesn't always give us the endings we plan. There's a house, Ethan, hidden in the mountains. My great-grandmother built it in 1949, after the war, after she lost everything. Her name was Eleanor Hale, and she was one of the only female engineers in North Carolina at the time. She designed this house to be a sanctuary, a place where the earth itself would keep you safe and warm. I inherited it 2 years ago, when my aunt passed. I didn't tell you because I wanted it to be a surprise. I was fixing it up, little by little, dreaming of the day we'd go there together. I thought we'd have weekends there, maybe even retire there someday. I thought we'd have more time. The house is yours now, and I need you to protect it. There are people who want to tear that mountain apart. They see only what's beneath the stone, what they can take, what they can sell. But that house is more than wood and rock. It's a testament to resilience, to survival, to the belief that we can build something that lasts, even when the world tries to break us. Eleanor built it after she lost her husband in the war. She built it when everyone told her she couldn't. She built it to prove that even in the darkest seasons, we can create something beautiful. Go there, Ethan. Take Jax. Let the mountain hold you the way I can't anymore. You're not lost. You're just between chapters. I love you more than words can hold. All my love, Grace. Ethan read it 3 times. By the 3rd read, his vision was blurred. He set the letter down carefully, as if it might shatter, and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Grace had known. Somehow, she'd known that he would need this. A place to go, a purpose, something to protect. He looked down at Jax. The shepherd was already on his feet, tail swaying slow and steady, eyes locked on Ethan's face. You ready for a trip, boy? Jax's ears perked forward, and a soft whine escaped his throat, not one of distress, but of anticipation. For the first time in months, Ethan felt something stir beneath the grief. A faint pulse of purpose, fragile but real. He stood and moved through the cabin with a clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. He pulled his old duffel bag from the closet and began to pack. Clothes, a first aid kit, his service knife, the blade still sharp after all these years, a flashlight, a waterproof case for Grace's letter, and the legal documents, a map of North Carolina. He loaded Jax's gear into the back of his truck, food, water, a collapsible bowl, and the tactical vest the dog hadn't worn since they'd both retired from active duty. The vest was faded and worn, but the Velcro still held. Ethan ran his hand over it, remembering the weight of missions and the bond forged in fire. The drive took 4 hours. Ethan followed the directions provided by the law firm, winding deeper into the Blue Ridge Mountains. The roads grew narrower, the trees thicker. Mist clung to the valleys like breath, and the air grew cooler as they climbed. The radio lost signal halfway up, replaced by static and silence. Ethan didn't mind. The quiet felt right. Jack sat in the passenger seat, head out the window, ears streaming back in the wind. His nose worked constantly, cataloging scents that Ethan couldn't even begin to imagine: pine resin and wet earth, animal trails and distant water, the complex tapestry of a living forest. They passed through small towns that looked like they'd been forgotten by time, gas stations with hand-painted signs, diners with gravel parking lots, churches with white steeples rising above the trees. People waved from porches as Ethan's truck rolled by, and he found himself waving back, a reflex from a life that felt very far away. The GPS on his phone flickered and died about 20 miles from the coordinates. Ethan switched to the paper map, tracing the route with his finger. The road he needed wasn't marked on any official map, it was just a thin pencil line. Grace had drawn, labeled in her handwriting, home. He found the turnoff just as the sun began to dip toward the western ridges. A narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for the truck, branching off from the main highway. There was no sign, no mailbox. Just an opening in the trees. Ethan turned onto it and drove slowly, the truck bouncing over roots and stones. Branches scraped the sides, and the forest pressed in close, ancient and watchful. The road climbed steadily, switchbacking up the mountainside. Ethan could feel the elevation in his ears, in the thin quality of the air. And then, the road ended. Ethan parked the truck in a small clearing and stepped out. The air was cold and thin, carrying the sharp scent of pine and stone. The ground beneath his boots was soft with moss and fallen needles. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint rush of water, a stream, maybe hidden in the folds of the land. Jax jumped down, landing soundlessly, and immediately began sweeping the area with his nose. His body was relaxed but alert, the posture of a professional assessing new terrain. Ethan looked up. Ahead, barely visible through the trees, was the house. It wasn't like anything he'd expected. The structure was built directly into the face of a massive stone ridge, as if the mountain had opened its mouth and swallowed the building whole. The front wall was made of dark timber and river stone, weathered by decades of wind and rain, but still solid. The windows were small and deep-set, like eyes watching from the shadows. The roof was covered in moss and wild grass, blending seamlessly into the hillside above. It looked less like a house and more like a natural formation, something that had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. It looked like it had been there for 1,000 years. Ethan walked forward slowly, his boots crunching on gravel. Jax moved ahead, ears swiveling, body tense, but not alarmed. The dog circled the perimeter of the clearing, checking for threats the way he'd been trained. Finding none, he returned to Ethan's side and sat, waiting. The front door was heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands that had turned green with age. There was no lock, just a simple latch, smooth from use. Ethan lifted it and pushed the door open. The hinges didn't creak. Inside, the air was warmer than it should have been. Not hot, just comfortable, like stepping into a room where a fire had been burning hours before. The transition from the cold mountain air to the gentle warmth of the interior was startling. Ethan paused in the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. The walls were smooth stone, carved directly from the mountain. Not rough or jagged, but shaped with precision, the work of someone who understood both geology and engineering. The floor was packed, earth-covered with wide planks of reclaimed wood, worn smooth by time. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and empty, yet the warmth in the room persisted. And yet, the house was warm. Ethan stepped further in, his senses heightened by years of training. The main room was open, with a vaulted ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. Light filtered through the small windows, soft and golden, illuminating particles of dust that hung suspended in the air. There was furniture, simple, handmade pieces that looked like they'd been built in place. A table, chairs, a bench near the fireplace. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but beneath it, Ethan could see care, intention, love. Jax padded beside him, nose working overtime. The dog moved through the space with the precision of a trained operator, checking corners, doorways, shadows. He paused at the fireplace, sniffing at the cold stones, then moved on to the kitchen area. The kitchen was simple but functional, a hand-pump sink, a cast-iron stove, open shelves lined with jars and tin canisters. There was a wooden counter with knife marks worn deep into the surface, evidence of decades of use. Ethan ran his hand over it, feeling the grain of the wood, the weight of history. Beyond the kitchen, a hallway led deeper into the mountain. Ethan could see 3 doors, 2 on the left, 1 on the right. He walked to the first door and opened it. A bedroom, simple. A bed frame made of rough-hewn logs, a thin mattress covered with a faded quilt, a small table beside the bed. A single window that looked out over the valley below, framing a view of endless ridges rolling into the distance, layer upon layer of blue and green. The second door led to a washroom, basic but functional. A deep basin carved from stone, fed by a pipe that emerged from the wall. A small mirror, its surface spotted with age. Shelves lined with glass jars that still held dried herbs, lavender, rosemary, sage. The third door was at the end of the hall. It was different from the others, heavier, with a metal handle that felt cold under Ethan's palm. He turned the handle and pulled. The door opened onto a staircase leading down into darkness. Ethan glanced at Jax. The dog's ears were pinned forward, his body coiled and ready. Not aggressive, alert. Focused. "Easy, boy." Ethan pulled the flashlight from his belt and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness below, revealing stone steps that descended into the heart of the mountain. The steps were narrow and steep, worn smooth in the center from years of use. He started down, Jax right behind him. The air grew cooler as they descended, but not uncomfortably so. It was the kind of cool that felt ancient, untouched by the seasons above. The walls on either side were smooth, almost polished, and Ethan realized they weren't just carved, they were shaped, engineered. Every angle, every curve was intentional. This wasn't the work of miners or laborers. This was the work of someone who understood physics and geology at a level most people never reached. At the bottom of the stairs was a chamber. It was circular, maybe 20 feet across, with a domed ceiling that rose into shadow. The walls were lined with metal pipes, copper and brass, green with age, but still intact. They ran in intricate patterns, looping and spiraling like veins, connecting to a central hub in the middle of the floor. The pipes varied in diameter, some as thin as a finger, others as thick as Ethan's arm. Ethan crouched down, running his hand over the metal. It was warm, not hot, but distinctly warm, as if heated from within. Jack circled the room slowly, sniffing at the base of the walls. His tail was low, his movements cautious. He paused at one section of the wall, pressing his nose against the stone, and let out a soft huff. Ethan stood and swept the flashlight beam across the ceiling. There were vents, small openings that seemed to lead further into the rock, disappearing into darkness. And carved into the stone above the central hub, etched with care and precision, was a symbol, a bird in flight, wings spread wide. The same symbol from the wax seal on Grace's letter. Ethan's chest tightened. This wasn't just a house. It was a machine, a living, breathing system designed to pull heat from deep within the earth and circulate it through the structure above. Geothermal engineering, decades ahead of its time, built by a woman in 1949, with nothing but her mind and her hands. Grace's great-grandmother had built this, alone. In an era when women weren't even allowed to vote in some places, Eleanor Hale had carved a sanctuary from the mountain itself. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the cool air. "She was a genius," he whispered. Jax's ears flicked back toward him, but the dog didn't leave his position near the far wall. His nose pressed against the stone, and a low rumble vibrated in his chest, not a growl, but a warning. A signal. Ethan moved to his side. "What is it, boy?" Jax pawed at the wall, then looked up at Ethan, eyes sharp and focused. Ethan pressed his palm against the stone where Jax had been sniffing, and felt it. A vibration, faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat, deep beneath the surface. It wasn't constant, it pulsed, slow and steady, as if something massive was moving far below. His pulse quickened. That wasn't natural. He stood there for a long moment, hand flat against the wall, feeling the steady thrum of something he couldn't see, something that shouldn't be there. The vibration traveled up through his arm, into his chest, unsettling and wrong. He turned and headed back up the stairs, Jax close at his heels. Back in the main room, Ethan stood in the center of the house, trying to process what he'd just felt. The warmth, the pipes, the vibration. Grace had said there were people who wanted to tear the mountain apart. Was this what she meant? Was someone already digging, already drilling? He pulled out his phone, still no signal, and checked the legal documents again. There was a contact number for the local ranger station. He'd have to drive back down the mountain to make the call. But before he could move, Jax's head snapped toward the front door. A second later, Ethan heard it too, the low rumble of an engine. He moved to the window and looked out, his body shifting into the calm, focused state that came from years of training. No panic, no rush, just awareness. A dark green pickup truck was rolling up the dirt road, moving slowly, deliberately. It stopped about 50 yards from the house, the engine idling for a moment before cutting off. Two men stepped out. They were dressed in work clothes, jeans, flannel shirts, steel-toed boots. But there was something off about the way they moved. Too smooth, too aware. These weren't ordinary workers. These were men who knew how to handle themselves. One of them carried a clipboard. The other had a radio clipped to his belt and a holstered sidearm visible under his jacket. Ethan stepped away from the window and moved to the door. He opened it and stood in the threshold, arms loose at his sides, posture neutral but ready. Jax appeared beside him, silent as smoke, his amber eyes locked on the two men. The men stopped when they saw Ethan. They exchanged a glance, quick, assessing, and then the one with the clipboard spoke first. "Didn't know anyone was up here." His voice was casual, but his eyes were sharp. He was scanning Ethan, reading him the way soldiers read each other. "Private property," Ethan said evenly. "Yeah, we know." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're with Appalachian Resource Solutions. We've been contracted to do some geological surveys in this area. Just routine stuff, making sure the land is stable before any development happens." Development. That's right. There's a lot of interest in these mountains. Old mining veins, mineral deposits. The company's looking to reopen some of the operations that shut down back in the 70s. Good for the economy, good for jobs. Ethan's jaw tightened. "This property isn't part of any mining operation." "Didn't say it was." The man glanced past Ethan toward the house, his eyes lingering on the stone structure. "But the ridge you're sitting on? That's a different story. We've got permits to drill test cores all along this section of the mountain. Geological assessments, standard procedure. Test cores. That's right, we'll be starting next week. Thought we'd give you a heads up, seeing as you're so close to the work zone. Might get loud, might feel a few vibrations. Nothing to worry about, but we like to keep the neighbors informed." Ethan stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. "And if I told you that this house is built into a geothermal system that's sensitive to seismic activity, that drilling into this ridge could destabilize the entire structure?" The man's smile faded slightly. "That sounds like a personal problem. It's going to be your problem if you damage this property." The second man, the one with the radio and the gun, shifted his weight. His hand didn't move toward the weapon, but the message was clear. Jax stepped out from behind Ethan, moving silently into view. The German shepherd's body was low, his eyes locked on the two men. He didn't growl. He didn't need to. The tension radiating from his body was louder than any sound. The second man took a half step back. "Nice dog." "He doesn't like strangers," Ethan said quietly. The man with the clipboard cleared his throat. "Look, we're just doing our job. You got a problem with the permits, take it up with the county. But the drilling's happening. You might want to think about relocating for a few weeks. For your own safety." "I'm not going anywhere." The two men exchanged another glance. Then the first one shrugged, his smile returning cold and thin. "Suit yourself, but don't say we didn't warn you." They turned and walked back to their truck, their movements unhurried but deliberate. Ethan watched them drive away, the sound of the engine fading into the trees. Jax stayed at his side, ears forward, muscles coiled and ready. Ethan looked down at the dog. "This just got a lot more complicated, boy. If you've ever stood your ground when others tried to take what wasn't theirs, Let us know in the comments. That afternoon, Ethan drove back down the mountain with Jax in the passenger seat. The forest rolled past in shades of green and shadow, and Ethan's mind churned through possibilities. He needed information. He needed allies. And he needed to understand exactly what Appalachian Resource Solutions was planning. He found the ranger station about 20 miles south of the property, tucked between two ridges in a small clearing. The building was modest wood-sided, with a metal roof and a faded sign that read McDowell County Forest Service. A single truck was parked out front, its paint chipped and worn. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and old paper. Maps covered the walls, topographical surveys, fire danger zones, wildlife migration routes. A man in his 50s sat behind a cluttered desk, reading a report with a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. He had a salt and pepper beard, weathered skin, and eyes that had seen too many winters. His name tag read, Silas Vance, Lead Ranger. Silas looked up when Ethan walked in. His gaze flicked immediately to Jax, and something shifted in his expression recognition, respect. "That's a working dog," Silas said. "Retired," Ethan replied. "So are you, I'm guessing." Silas set down his report and leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades reading people. "Military? Navy?" "Thought so. You've got the posture, the eyes." Silas nodded toward Jax. "And the kind of dog that doesn't quit." Ethan allowed a faint smile. "He's saved my life more than once." "I believe it." Silas gestured to a chair across from his desk. "What brings you up here?" Ethan sat down, Jax settling at his feet. He explained briefly, carefully, the inheritance, the house, the letter from Grace. He described the structure built into the ridge, the geothermal system, the men from Appalachian Resource Solutions, and their plans to drill. Silas's expression darkened with every sentence. "Ours," he muttered, shaking his head. "Yeah, I know them. They've been sniffing around this area for the last 6 months, bought up a bunch of old mining claims from people who didn't know what they were signing away. Got themselves some permits from county officials who didn't ask enough questions. They said they're drilling test cores," Ethan said. "They are. And if they find what they're looking for, they'll tear this whole ridge apart." Silas pulled a large topographical map from the stack on his desk and spread it out. He tapped a section marked in red ink. "This is the area they've targeted. Old iron and copper veins, mostly played out by the 1,960 seconds. But there's also rare earth minerals stuff that's worth a fortune these days. Lithium, cobalt, elements used in batteries and electronics. The kind of thing companies will kill for." Ethan's chest tightened. "And the ridge is unstable?" "Unstable is putting it mildly." Silas traced his finger along the red-marked area. "This whole section of the mountain is riddled with old tunnels and shafts from the mining operations in the 40s and 50s. Most of them were never properly sealed. Add in natural fault lines and underground water channels, and you've got a geological powder keg. Start drilling in the wrong place, and you could trigger a collapse that takes down half the ridge." "How unstable are we talking?" Silas looked him in the eye. "Unstable enough that the last mining company to work this area pulled out in 1973 after a tunnel collapse killed 4 men. They sealed the site and left. No one's touched it since, until now." Ethan felt a cold weight settle in his gut. Can they be stopped? Legally? It's complicated. They've got permits from the county, but those permits were issued based on incomplete geological surveys. If you can prove the drilling poses an immediate threat to a historical or protected structure, you might be able to get an emergency injunction. Shut them down long enough to force a full environmental and safety review. How do I prove that? You'd need documentation, historical records, engineering reports, proof that the house is significant and that the geothermal system is sensitive to seismic activity. Silas paused, leaning forward. "Your house? It's the old Hale property, isn't it?" Ethan nodded. Silas whistled low, a sound of genuine awe. "I've heard stories about that place my whole life. My grandfather used to talk about Eleanor Hale, said she was a genius. Built that house with her own hands after the war, after she lost her husband. People thought she was crazy, but she proved them all wrong. Grace's great-grandmother. Then you've got a case. That house is a piece of history. If you can document its significance, get some engineers or historians to assess the structure and the geothermal system, you might be able to make ARS back off, or at least force them to move their drilling operations far enough away that they won't cause damage. And if I can't? Silas met his eyes, his expression grim. Then you'd better hope they don't hit a fault line, because if they do, that house and everything on that ridge is coming down. The weight of those words settled over Ethan like a shroud. He looked down at Jax, who was watching him with steady, unwavering eyes. "I need to see those permits," Ethan said. "Already pulled them." Silas slid a folder across the desk. "County records. Everything ARS filed. It's not pretty." Ethan opened the folder and scanned the documents. Geological survey reports, thin, rushed, incomplete. Environmental impact assessments that were barely more than form letters. Permits signed by officials whose names Ethan didn't recognize. It was a rubber stamp job. ARS had paid the right people and pushed the paperwork through without proper oversight. "This is a disaster waiting to happen," Ethan said. "You're not wrong." Silas leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "But stopping it is going to take more than anger. You'll need evidence, legal grounds, and time." "How much time do I have?" "They said they're starting next week, so not much." Ethan closed the folder and stood. "Thank you, Brooks." Silas stood as well, his expression serious. "Be careful. ARS has deep pockets and friends in high places. They're not going to take kindly to someone standing in their way. I've dealt with worse." "I believe you." Silas extended his hand. "But if you need help, legal, logistical, whatever you call me, that house is part of this mountain's history. It's worth protecting." Ethan shook his hand. "I will." He drove back to the house as the sun dipped below the ridgeline, painting the sky in shades of copper and ash. Jack sat beside him, silent and watchful. When they arrived, the forest was unnaturally quiet, too quiet. Ethan stepped out of the truck and listened. No birds, no wind, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the faint, distant hum of machinery. His instincts flared. He walked around the side of the house, following the sound. Jax moved ahead, nose low to the ground, body tense. About 100 yards into the trees, Ethan found what he was looking for. Survey markers, bright orange flags tied to wooden stakes driven into the earth, a line of them marching up the ridge, cutting through the forest like a scar. The stakes were spaced about 20 feet apart, marking the path for drilling operations. And at the far end, barely visible through the dusk, was a drill rig. It was silent now, but the earth around it was torn and raw, the soil dark and wet. Ethan could see the mouth of a test hole, maybe 6 inches wide, disappearing into the ground. Fresh earth was piled around it, evidence that they'd already begun. Jax growled, low, deep, primal. Ethan felt it too. The wrongness, the violation. This wasn't just drilling. This was an assault on the mountain itself. He turned and walked back to the house, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. That night, Ethan spread Grace's letter, the legal documents from the law firm, and the permits from Silas across the kitchen table. Jax lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes half open but alert. The house was warm, the air still. But Ethan could feel the faint vibration beneath the floor, stronger now than it had been that morning. A subtle tremor, like the mountain was holding its breath. He wrote down everything he knew. The house was built in 1949 by Grace's great-grandmother, Eleanor Hale, a pioneering female engineer. It used geothermal heat pulled from deep within the mountain, decades ahead of its time. The ridge was geologically unstable, riddled with old mining tunnels and natural fault lines. Appalachian Resource Solutions was drilling test cores less than 100 yards away. If they drilled too deep or in the wrong place, the whole system and the mountain could collapse. He needed proof, documentation, evidence that the house was worth protecting, that it was historically significant, and that the drilling posed an immediate threat. And he needed it fast. The next morning, Ethan woke before dawn. He fed Jax, packed a thermos of coffee, and drove into Asheville as the first light touched the ridges. The city was waking up slowly, shops opening, people heading to work, the smell of fresh bread drifting from a bakery on the corner. He found the law firm Caldwell and Finch in a restored brick building on a quiet street lined with oak trees. The receptionist was polite but guarded, her smile professional. Ethan explained who he was, and after a brief wait, he was shown into a small office where a woman in her 60s sat behind a desk covered in file folders. Her name was Margaret Finch. She had sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and a firm handshake that spoke of decades of no-nonsense professionalism. "Mr. Brooks," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your wife was a remarkable woman, brilliant, kind, and deeply principled." "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice rough. "She came to see me about a year ago, told me about the house, about her plans to restore it, to share it with you. She was so excited." Margaret's expression softened. "She also told me she was worried that someone might try to take it from you, from her family." She was right. Margaret nodded slowly. She usually was. She pulled a thick folder from a drawer and set it on the desk between them. "Grace requested that I compile everything related to the property. Historical records, blueprints, photographs, legal documents. She knew this day might come." She opened the folder carefully. Inside were dozens of pages, meticulously organized. Blueprints marked with measurements and technical notes. Photographs, black and white, slightly faded, showing the construction process. Letters written in careful script. And, at the very front, a document signed and notarized by the North Carolina Historical Society certifying the house as a structure of historical and architectural significance. Ethan stared at the document, his chest tight. "Grace did all this?" he asked. "She did. She spent months gathering evidence, reaching out to historians and engineers, building a case." Margaret slid a photograph across the desk. "This is Eleanor Hale." The photograph was old, the edges worn. It showed a woman in her 30s standing in front of the house, wearing work clothes, trousers, a flannel shirt, boots caked with mud. Her hair was short, her face strong and determined. Behind her, the stone ridge rose like a fortress, and scaffolding surrounded the house, evidence of construction still in progress. "That was taken in 1950, Margaret said. "Eleanor designed that house herself, drew the blueprints, supervised the construction. She was one of the first female engineers to be certified in North Carolina. The state board tried to deny her license 3 times, but she fought them. She won. And then she built that house to prove she could." Ethan studied the photograph, feeling a deep connection to this woman he'd never met, a woman who'd lost everything and built something beautiful from the ruins. "She built it as a refuge," Margaret continued, "a place where she could live off the grid, independent and safe. The geothermal system was revolutionary. She presented her designs to the State Engineering Board in 1950. They're still on file. Can I get copies?" "I have them right here." Margaret pulled another folder from the stack. "Eleanor's original engineering reports. Detailed schematics of the geothermal system. Temperature data. Efficiency calculations. Everything you need to prove that the house is not only historically significant, but also technologically advanced." She handed the folder to Ethan. "Grace asked me to give this to you when you were ready. She believed in you, Mr. Brooks. She believed you would protect this place the way Eleanor protected it." Ethan closed the folder and looked up at Margaret. She knew someone would try to destroy it. She did, and she trusted you to stop them. Ethan stood, holding the folder carefully. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks." Margaret stood as well, her expression serious. "Your wife loved that house. But more than that, She loved what it represented: resilience, survival, the belief that we can build something that lasts even when the world tries to break us. Don't let them take it. I won't. He drove back to the mountain with the folders on the seat beside him and Jax's solid warmth pressed against his leg. The forest rolled past in a blur of green and shadow, and Ethan's mind was already moving ahead, planning his next steps. When he arrived at the property, the drill rig was running. The sound was deafening, a mechanical scream that echoed through the forest, shaking the air itself. Ethan could feel it in his bones, in the steering wheel, in the ground beneath the truck. He parked and stepped out. Jax jumped down, ears flat against his skull, teeth bared in a silent snarl. The rig was maybe 75 yards from the house now, chewing into the earth with brutal efficiency. Men in hard hats moved around it, shouting instructions over the noise. Ethan could see fresh holes drilled into the ground, 3, maybe 4, each one disappearing into darkness. One of the men was the man with the clipboard from before. Ethan walked toward them, the folders tucked under his arm. Jax stayed close, his body coiled and ready. The man saw him coming and waved. He said something to the others, and the rig powered down. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise, heavy, oppressive, filled with tension. "Mr. Brooks," the man said, pulling off his hard hat, "didn't expect to see you again so soon. You need to stop," Ethan said evenly. The man laughed short, sharp, dismissive. "We talked about this. We've got permits. And I've got documentation that this site is protected under the North Carolina Historical Preservation Act." Ethan opened the first folder and pulled out the certification. "This house is a registered historical structure. Any drilling within 200 yards requires environmental and historical impact assessments. You don't have those." The man's smile faded. He took the paper and scanned it, his jaw tightening. Then he handed it back, his expression hard. "This doesn't change anything." "It changes everything. If you keep drilling, I'll file for an emergency injunction, and if you cause any damage to that house or the ridge, you'll be liable for criminal and civil penalties." The man stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "You really want to play this game? ARS has lawyers. Good ones. We'll tie you up in court for years. You'll spend every penny you have fighting us, and you'll still lose." Ethan didn't move. "I'm not playing." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. The other workers had stopped, watching the exchange with cautious interest. The air was thick with unspoken threats. Jax's growl was low and steady, a warning written in sound. His eyes never left the man's face. Finally, the man stepped back, his expression cold. "We'll see what the lawyers say." "You do that." Ethan turned and walked back to the house, his heart pounding but his stride steady. Jax stayed at his side, ears forward, tail low. Inside, Ethan stood in the center of the main room and let the warmth of the house settle over him. He could still feel the vibration beneath the floor, but it was softer now, steadier. The house was holding. He pulled out his phone, still no signal, and made a note to contact Silas in the morning. He needed to file the injunction immediately before ARS could do any more damage. But that night, something changed. Ethan woke just after midnight to the sound of Jax's low, insistent whine. The dog was standing at the foot of the bed, ears pinned forward, eyes locked on the door. His body was tense, every muscle coiled like a spring. Ethan sat up, instantly alert. "What is it, boy?" Jax moved to the door and pawed at it, looking back at Ethan with urgent eyes. Ethan pulled on his boots and grabbed his flashlight. He followed Jax down the hall, through the main room, and out the front door. The night was cold and clear, the stars sharp as broken glass overhead. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. No wind, no animals. Just the faint, rhythmic hum of something deep beneath the earth. But Jax wasn't looking at the forest. He was looking at the ground. Ethan clicked on the flashlight and swept the beam across the earth in front of the house, and saw the crack. It was thin, maybe an inch wide, but it ran from the base of the ridge all the way to the edge of the tree line, a distance of at least 50 feet. The earth on either side was uneven, as if something beneath had shifted. Fresh soil had been pushed up along the edges, and the crack itself was dark, disappearing into shadow. Ethan's blood ran cold. He followed the crack, Jax moving ahead of him, nose pressed to the ground. The dog moved with purpose, his body low and focused. The crack led straight toward the drill site, growing wider as it went. When they reached the rig, Ethan saw it. The test hole they'd drilled that afternoon had collapsed inward, leaving a dark, gaping pit. And from the pit, faint wisps of steam were rising into the cold night air, glowing faintly in the beam of his flashlight. Jax stopped at the edge and growled, a sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. Ethan knelt down, shining the flashlight into the hole. He could see water, hot water, bubbling up from deep below, hissing and spitting. And beneath that, the unmistakable sound of something groaning, like the mountain itself, was shifting under immense pressure. He stood and backed away slowly, his mind racing. This wasn't just unstable, this was critical. They drilled directly into a pressurized geothermal vent. The crack in the ground was evidence of subsurface collapse. If the pressure wasn't released, if the vent ruptured, Ethan didn't finish the thought. He ran. Back to the house, back to the truck. He drove down the mountain faster than he should have. Jax braced in the passenger seat and didn't stop until he reached the ranger station. Silas was there, surprisingly, working late by the light of a single desk lamp. He looked up when Ethan burst through the door, his expression shifting immediately from surprise to alarm. "They hit something," Ethan said, breathless. "They drilled into a geothermal pocket. The ridge is collapsing." Silas's face went white. He grabbed his radio from the desk. "How bad?" "Bad enough that there's steam coming out of the hole and a crack running straight toward the house. The ground is shifting." Silas swore and keyed the radio. "This is Vance. I need a geological assessment team at the Hale Ridge site immediately. Possible subsurface collapse, geothermal breach, code red." He looked at Ethan, his eyes hard. "Get back up there. Don't go inside the house. If that ridge shifts, the whole structure could come down." "I'm not leaving it." "Brooks." "I'm not leaving." Silas held his gaze for a long moment, reading the determination there. Then he nodded, grabbing his coat and keys. "Then I'm coming with you." They drove back up the mountain in convoy, Silas's truck following close behind Ethan's. When they arrived, the crack had widened. Ethan could see it even in the dark, a jagged line cutting through the earth like a wound, several inches wide now, the edges crumbling. Jax jumped out and immediately began pacing along the edge, whining and barking short, sharp alerts. Silas parked and stepped out, flashlight in hand. He walked to the crack, knelt down, and pressed his palm against the ground. "It's warm," he said quietly, his voice tight with concern. "They hit a thermal vent," Ethan said. "If they keep drilling, or if that vent ruptures, they won't." Silas stood and pulled out his phone, dialing rapidly. "I'm calling the county engineer and the state geological survey. This site's getting shut down tonight. Emergency order." But before he could finish the call, the ground shook. It was subtle at first, a low rumble that Ethan felt more than heard, traveling up through his boots. Then it grew, building into a sharp, violent jolt that knocked Silas off balance and sent loose rocks tumbling down the ridge. Jack sparked a sharp, urgent warning, his body tense and ready. And then, from somewhere deep inside the ridge, came the sound of stone breaking. It was a sound Ethan had never heard before, a deep, resonant crack that seemed to split the air itself. The ground beneath his feet shuddered, and the crack in the earth widened, spreading like a living thing. Ethan ran. He ran toward the house, toward the door, his boots pounding on the uneven ground. Jax was faster, reaching the threshold first and spinning back to face him, barking furiously. "No!" Silas shouted from behind. "Brooks, don't!" But Ethan was already inside. The house was shaking, not violently, but steadily, rhythmically, like a heartbeat gone wild. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the copper pipes along the walls groaned and hissed, vibrating with pressure. The floor beneath his feet felt unstable, as if the mountain itself was breathing. Ethan ran to the door at the end of the hall and yanked it open. He took the stairs 2 at a time, Jack's right behind him, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly off the stone walls. In the chamber below, the vibration was deafening. The central hub in the floor was glowing faint at first, then brighter, red-hot like the heart of a forge. The metal pipes were rattling violently, and from somewhere deep beneath, Ethan could hear the rush of water under immense pressure, building, ready to explode. He stood there, breathing hard, trying to think through the adrenaline and fear. If the thermal vent ruptured, the pressure would blow out the entire system. The house would collapse. The ridge would collapse. Everything Grace's great-grandmother had built, everything Grace had tried to protect, would be destroyed. But if he could release the pressure, slowly redirect it before it reached critical mass, he moved to the central hub and knelt down. The metal was hot, almost too hot to touch, but he forced his hands to stay steady. There was a valve, old, corroded, green with age, but still functional. Eleanor had built in a fail-safe, a way to manually bleed off excess pressure in case of emergency. Ethan gripped the valve with both hands and turned. It didn't move. He tried again, harder this time, his muscles straining, his hands burning from the heat. The valve was stuck, sealed by decades of mineral buildup. Jax paced behind him, whining, his claws clicking on the stone floor. "Come on," Ethan muttered through gritted teeth. "Come on." He put his full weight into it, leveraging his body, using every ounce of strength he had. The valve broke free. A jet of steam erupted from the hub, screaming into the chamber with a sound like a freight train. Ethan threw himself back, shielding his face with his arm. The pressure was intense, almost unbearable, and the heat was suffocating. The steam filled the chamber, thick and choking. But the pipes began to stabilize. The rattling slowed. The glow faded from red-hot to dull orange to nothing. Slowly, carefully, Ethan reached forward and closed the valve halfway, letting the pressure bleed off in controlled bursts rather than a catastrophic release. The hissing softened. The shaking stopped. The mountain exhaled. Ethan collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving, his hands burned and trembling. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the condensation from the steam. Jax pressed against him, licking his face, his body warm and solid and real. "Good boy," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse. "Good boy." Above, he could hear Silas shouting his name. Ethan climbed the stairs slowly, every muscle in his body screaming. His legs felt like lead, and his hands were raw and blistered. Jack stayed close, supporting him with his solid presence. When he emerged into the main room, Silas was standing in the doorway, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "You're insane," Silas said, his voice shaking. "Probably," Ethan replied, leaning against the wall. "You could have been killed. The whole structure could have come down on top of you. But it didn't." Silas shook his head, half in disbelief, half in reluctant admiration. "The county engineer's on his way. So is a team from the State Geological Survey. I've issued an emergency cease and desist order. ARS is getting shut down pending a full investigation." Ethan nodded, too exhausted to speak. Silas looked around the house, taking in the stone walls, the smooth floor, the warmth that still radiated from deep within despite the crisis. "This place is a miracle. You know that, right?" "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "I know. When the truth needs to be heard, share this story with someone who believes that some things are worth fighting for." The investigation took 3 weeks. Engineers from the State Geological Survey descended on the site, mapping the ridge, analyzing the thermal vents, documenting the damage caused by ARS's drilling. They brought equipment, seismic monitors, ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging cameras, and worked methodically, building a case that was impossible to ignore. The findings were damning. Appalachian Resource Solutions had ignored multiple geological warnings. They'd bypassed required environmental assessments. They'd drilled directly into a pressurized geothermal system without proper safeguards. The test cores they'd drilled had destabilized the ridge, causing subsurface collapses and triggering seismic shifts that could have resulted in a catastrophic failure. The site was declared a critical hazard zone. All drilling operations were permanently halted. ARS was fined heavily, their permits revoked, and the company faced criminal charges for environmental negligence. The land around the ridge was placed under a conservation easement, protected from future development. And the house, Grace's house, Eleanor's house, was officially recognized as a protected historical landmark by the state of North Carolina. Ethan stood on the ridge one cold morning in early spring, Jax at his side, and looked out over the valley. The trees were beginning to bud, tiny flashes of green breaking through the gray. The air was soft with the promise of new life, and the forest hummed with the sounds of birds returning from their winter migrations. Inside the house, on the kitchen table, was a small wooden box. Ethan had found it in the sealed chamber below, tucked into a niche in the wall behind one of the copper pipes. The box was simple, hand-carved, with Eleanor's initials etched into the lid. Inside was another letter from Grace. The paper was slightly yellowed, the ink faded but still clear. Ethan had read it once, and the words were carved into his memory. Ethan, if you're reading this, you've protected the house. You've honored what Eleanor built, and you've proven that even in the hardest seasons, we can still stand firm. I'm so proud of you. Eleanor built this place to survive. She built it to endure, and she built it with the belief that we can create something beautiful even when the world tries to break us. Live here, or don't, but know that this place is yours now, a sanctuary, a reminder that you are never as lost as you feel. The mountain will hold you when I can't. I love you, always. Grace. Beside the letter was a small photograph, the same one Margaret had shown him, of Eleanor standing in front of the house, strong and determined, dirt on her hands and fire in her eyes. And tucked behind the photograph was a folded piece of paper, a blueprint, hand-drawn, labeled in Eleanor's careful script, Expansion Plans, 1952. Ethan had studied it for hours. Eleanor had dreamed of expanding the house, adding more rooms carved into the mountain, creating a network of chambers that would function as a self-sustaining sanctuary. She'd never completed the project. Life had intervened, as it always does, but the plans were there, waiting. Ethan folded the blueprint carefully and slid it back into the box. He wasn't ready to expand yet. But someday, maybe, someday when the grief had softened and the future felt less like an abyss. For now, he had enough. He had the house, he had the mountain, he had Jax. And he had a purpose: to protect this place, to honor the women who had built it and loved it, and to remind himself that even in loss, there can be new beginnings. Ethan exhaled slowly, the cold air sharp in his lungs. Jax leaned against his leg, solid and warm, his tail wagging slowly. "We're staying, boy," Ethan said quietly. "This is home now." Jax's tail wagged once more, slow and steady. And for the first time, in a long time, Ethan Brooks felt something he thought he'd lost forever: peace. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet work. Ethan spent his days repairing and restoring the house, replacing rotted wood, cleaning the copper pipes, reinforcing the stone walls where age and time had taken their toll. Jax was his constant companion, always nearby, always watching with those intelligent amber eyes. Silas visited often, bringing supplies and updates. The legal battle with ARS was ongoing, but the state had stepped in with full force. The company's reputation was in tatters, and several executives were facing criminal charges. The ridge was safe. Margaret Finch came up once, bringing more documents and photographs from Eleanor's life. She stayed for an afternoon, walking through the house with reverence, marveling at the craftsmanship and vision that had created it. "Your wife would be so proud," Margaret said as she prepared to leave. "And Eleanor, wherever she is, she'd be grateful." "I hope so," Ethan replied. As winter turned to spring, the mountain came alive. Wildflowers bloomed along the ridge trillium and bloodroot and mountain laurel. Deer appeared in the clearings at dusk. Birds nested in the eaves of the house, their songs filling the air. And slowly, carefully, Ethan began to heal. He still thought about Grace every day. He still felt the ache of her absence, the hollow space where her voice used to be. But the grief was no longer suffocating. It had become something he could carry, something that existed alongside hope rather than crushing it. One evening, as the sun set behind the western ridges, Ethan sat on the porch with Jax at his feet. The house was warm behind him, radiating the steady heat of the earth. The valley below was bathed in gold and shadow, and the air smelled of pine and rain. He pulled out Grace's letter and read it one more time. "You're not lost. You're just between chapters." Ethan folded the letter carefully and slid it back into his pocket. He looked down at Jax, who was watching him with steady, knowing eyes. "She was right, you know," Ethan said quietly. "We're not lost. We're just finding our way." Jax's tail thumped once against the wooden planks. Ethan smiled a real smile, small but genuine, the first in months. And in that moment, sitting on the porch of a house built into the mountain, with a loyal dog at his side and the memory of the woman he loved carried in his heart, Ethan Brooks understood something profound. Grief and hope can exist together. Loss and love are not opposites, they are two sides of the same coin. And sometimes the greatest act of courage is not charging into battle, but choosing to stand still and let the world heal you. The mountain held him, the house warmed him, and Grace, wherever she was, smiled. What lessons have you learned from the hardest seasons of your life? Share your reflections in the comments below. Months passed, the seasons turned. Summer came, bringing heat and thunderstorms that rolled through the valleys like freight trains. Ethan worked on the house, expanding his knowledge of the geothermal system, learning its rhythms and patterns the way Eleanor must have decades before. He found journals she'd left behind, leather-bound books filled with observations and calculations, notes on temperature fluctuations and seasonal variations. Reading them was like having a conversation with a genius across time. He also found community. Silas introduced him to other rangers, to locals who'd lived in the mountains their whole lives. They were wary at first. Outsiders were always treated with caution, but when they learned what Ethan had done, how he'd stood up to ARS and protected the ridge, they welcomed him. He became part of the mountain, as much as the trees and stone. And Jax loyal, steadfast, Jax remained his anchor. The dog thrived in the wilderness, his instincts sharp, his spirit alive. He roamed the ridge during the day, always returning by dusk, always checking on Ethan with those watchful eyes. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves turned gold and red, Ethan received a letter. It was from a university in Raleigh, a team of historians and engineers who'd heard about the house and wanted to study it. They were writing a book on pioneering female engineers in the South, and Eleanor Hale was to be featured prominently. They asked for permission to visit, to document the house, to interview Ethan about his experiences. He said yes. The team arrived a week later, 3 academics with cameras and notebooks and an infectious enthusiasm. They spent 2 days photographing every inch of the house, measuring and documenting, marveling at the ingenuity and craftsmanship. One of them, a young woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, sat with Ethan on the porch as the sun set. "This house is extraordinary," she said. Eleanor was 50 years ahead of her time. The geothermal principles she applied, they're still cutting edge today. She was remarkable, Ethan agreed. "And so are you," Dr. Chen said. "You fought for this place. You protected it. That takes courage." Ethan shook his head. "I just did what needed to be done. That's what heroes always say." She smiled. "Your story, Eleanor's story, Grace's story, it's important. It reminds people that buildings aren't just structures, they're legacies. They're testaments to the people who believed in something bigger than themselves." Ethan looked out over the valley, at the ridges rolling into the distance, layer upon layer of ancient stone and living forest. Grace believed that, he said quietly. She believed this place was worth protecting, and she was right. Dr. Chen nodded. We'll make sure people know. We'll make sure Eleanor's legacy and Grace's lives on. As winter approached again, Ethan prepared the house for the cold. He stocked firewood, reinforced the shutters, checked the geothermal system for any signs of wear. Jax's coat thickened, and the dog seemed to relish the crisp air and the first dustings of snow. One evening, as the first real storm of the season rolled in, Ethan sat by the fire with Jax at his feet. The house was warm, the air filled with the scent of burning wood and pine. Outside, the wind howled and snow fell in thick, heavy flakes. Ethan pulled out the wooden box and opened it. Inside were Grace's letters, Eleanor's blueprints, the photograph of the house under construction. He ran his fingers over the edges of the papers, feeling the weight of history and love. And then he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He spoke to Grace. "I miss you," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "Every day, I miss you. But I'm okay. I'm finding my way. You gave me this gift, this place, this purpose, and I'm grateful." Jax lifted his head, watching Ethan with those steady eyes. "I think Eleanor would be proud," Ethan continued. "I think she'd be glad her house is still standing, still protecting, still warm, and I think she'd be glad you found it, that you loved it, that you trusted me to take care of it." The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney. "I'm going to stay here," Ethan said, "for as long as I can. I'm going to protect this place the way you wanted me to, and maybe someday, I'll even finish Eleanor's expansion plans, build something new, something that honors both of you." He closed the box and set it gently on the table. Outside, the storm raged. But inside, the house was a sanctuary, warm, safe, enduring. Jax moved closer, resting his head on Ethan's knee. Ethan ran his hand over the dog's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "We're home, boy," Ethan whispered. "We're finally home." And deep within the mountain, where stone met heat and earth met sky, the house breathed. It had survived wars and winters, storms and silence. It had held Eleanor through her grief, and now it held Ethan through his. It had been built by a woman who refused to be broken, inherited by a woman who saw its worth, and protected by a man who understood the weight of legacy. The house was more than wood and stone. It was a promise, a testament, a reminder that even in the darkest seasons we can build something that endures. And as the snow fell and the fire burned and the mountain held them close, Ethan Brooks finally understood what Grace had been trying to tell him. He wasn't lost. He was found. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes that faith still lives in ordinary days. Leave a comment about the blessings you've witnessed in your own life. And subscribe for more stories that remind us we are never too lost to be found again. May God bless you, keep you warm in your winters, and fill your home with the quiet, steady light of hope.